Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. Some of the statistics we see is for every dollar you put into mitigation or disaster risk reduction, you could actually save up to $4 to $6 on the recovery. This episode today, I'm talking with Elaine Angeles. She's a Humanitarian Affairs Adviser for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in New York. She's originally from the Philippines and so grew up understanding the importance of mitigating risk and how it can actually impact your livelihood. So stay tuned. Hey, Elaine, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Leanne.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know you've got a very interesting background, and so just, before we get into the whole topic of DRR, can you explain a little bit about your background?
Sure. So first of all, my name is Elaine Angeles. I am a humanitarian and development professional with extensive experience working with communities and local governments and other partners on disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation programs. I'm passionate about inclusive and sustainable development and the increased use of scientific knowledge in building resilient communities. So maybe I tell you also a little bit about what resilience means for me. In part, I'm interested and passionate. I'm passionate about inclusive and sustainable development and the increased use of scientific knowledge in building resilient communities. And this is in part due to my training in environmental science and policy, and largely because of my exposure and experience. I'm originally from the Philippines. In this context, I understand that resilience means that my home does not get submerged in floodwaters once a year, or my neighbors' children are safe in the event of earthquakes, or farmers' crops are not completely destroyed in the event of a typhoon. It also means that local governments have early warning systems and are able to plan ahead, and that communities are empowered and supported so they can quickly bounce back from disasters.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, you kind of came into this work just because of the nature of where you grew up,
Exactly, yes.
having to do some of this disaster risk reduction. So I know right now you're working in New York, and can you tell us a little bit of the work you're doing with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies?
Sure. So I recently joined the IFRC, and I work as an advisor for the IFRC delegation to the United Nations. My role is to help understand the global humanitarian policy space and work with member states and other partners in shaping the disaster risk reduction and climate policies. So IFRC brings with it, a century's worth of expertise with its over 190 national societies working with the most vulnerable communities around the world. We also have reference centers such as the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center that is working at the intersection of climate policy and practice. And they are contributing knowledge and guidance on how to manage risks of extreme weather events.
So can you give an example of perhaps a community or someone who you think is actually addressing the whole disaster risk reduction area effectively?
Yes. In my work when I was back in the Philippines, I worked on a disaster risk reduction program, and in that role, I worked a lot with local governments, and they are developing plans and protocols and how they can pre-position goods and services, but at the same time, strengthening their capacities for early warning and using forecasts to anticipate risks and help communities prepare for these risks. So I think one of the successes that I saw is in a time when there was a typhoon that's forecasted to hit the Philippines, they were able to really prepare for that and reduce the number of casualties and losses from the typhoon.
When it comes to disaster risk reduction, are there specific areas a community should be looking at other than, major infrastructure like highways and bridges and airports?
Yes, definitely. So there should also be attention given to water sanitation and hygiene, for example, and public health. So these are also areas that are really critical for local governments and the humanitarian development sector to look into, because the impacts of disasters could also be in this many different dimensions. And so aside from the structural, the built environment, flood walls, sea walls, and things like that, there should also be attention given to non structural measures.
Yeah. No, that's great. So can you give an example of, I mean, in the work you're doing, I'm sure you're meeting people from around the world in this network, and I'm just curious, is there anyone that particularly stands out with some of the work they're doing that I look at Amsterdam and how they've over the years had to manage water and flooding. But are there other communities that you're seeing that are really doing good work that perhaps if someone's watching this, they could refer to that community and see some of the work they're doing?
Yes, definitely. There are a number of communities, for example, in Europe that are doing a lot of good things, especially those that are prone to heat waves, extreme heat
Yeah.
in cities. There are also a number of communities in Southeast Asia, particularly farming communities, that are trying to develop new ways and innovating on how they can adjust their planting cycles and methods so they can produce crops and not lose their livelihood in the event, of changing weather patterns.
Okay, and so I know one of the things when I'm out talking to communities, and it's a stat, I think it's a FEMA stat, but talks about, for every dollar you put into mitigation, into that upfront disaster risk reduction, you're going to save, I've seen stats anywhere from $4 to $7 on the recovery. Is that something that you're doing any work in, or you're familiar with some of those statistics, or?
Oh, yes. So definitely, this is something that has been, mentioned in the past, and we're really trying to make sure that we invest in early actions. And I think one of the projects that IFRC, together with other UN agencies and other private partners and technical agencies, also, we're doing an initiative called forecast-based financing, and this initiative aims to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and policy and practice, and trying to, so the forecast-based financing is an approach to enable access to humanitarian funding based on the analysis of risks and meteorological forecasts. So it bridges that gap between scientific knowledge and tries to translate data and scientific knowledge
Yeah.
to actions at the community level. So this is one initiative that we're doing.
That's great, because often there is a real disconnect there, right? I mean, it's from all those areas that you mentioned. I mean, you're on the front lines, you're not connected with this other work, but also the people that are doing the research are sometimes not connected with the on the ground, what actually happens. And so bringing that all together, that's great. Are there any other initiatives that you want to speak about that you're involved in currently that you find rather exciting, whether they're just started or they're ongoing?
There are many. There are also, disaster risk reduction trainings, building capacities of local communities and local governments on how they can prepare for disasters and respond during disasters. So there's another program called Seasonal Livelihood Programming, which is a comprehensive community-based planning tool that helps farmers adjust, their planting cycles and methods to reduce their vulnerability to
Oh,
the changing weather patterns.
great. And so is that if after this, like, just send me that link and I'll put that information on the video below. the description. So if people want to find out about those programs or those resources, is there anything else you can think of as far as some valuable resources or port websites that might be helpful if people want to get more information on disaster risk reduction?
Sure. So in IFRC, we have developed several publications. One of them we just launched in September during the climate summit at the UN. It's called The Cost of Doing Nothing. It's a report that contains analysis showing that if no urgent action is taken right now, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance could double yearly by year 2050. But at the same time, it shows that if appropriate climate adaptation actions are taken, then these figures could also stabilize or even drop. We also have a heat wave guide for cities, and this is something that was developed to provide information and recommendations to governments and partners on how they can understand and prepare for the risks of heat waves. So there are these publications from different agencies. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, a resource center called the Red Crescent Climate Center. And it's also a good resource for people who want to understand the science and understand how that links back to policy and practice.
That's great. And I know, partly that when you talk about the stats of people, the humanitarian numbers, I think some of this work, obviously, this risk reduction, the preparedness, all of that plays in so well because, if people are trying to mitigate their risk, they're trying to be more prepared, that at the end of the day, those costs should go down, even though the impact, number of people might go up. Hopefully, there's been some other changes, whether it's from a policy standpoint or a practice standpoint. So that will make a difference, hopefully, in the future. Is there anything before we close, anything else you want to mention about the work you're doing or some of the exciting challenges ahead?
Disasters don't need to happen, and to build resilient communities, we need to ensure that the right information are reaching the right people at the right time, and that we understand the multiple dimensions by which people are affected by disasters, and that we come up with appropriate actions, whether that's at the community level, at the national level, international level, and that we come up with appropriate responses, and that we are able to fund those actions as well to truly transform communities so that they can really be able to prepare for, reduce the impacts of, and cope with disasters.
That's awesome. Thank you for spending some time today, Elaine, with me to just talk about some of that work you're doing in New York. And obviously, I'm sure some of this work is work you want to take directly back to the Philippines and help them become more resilient in the future. So thank you very much, and best of luck.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be on this channel.